Same old man. Game over.
Johnny. You're gonna need a bigger potion.
Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Oh, welcome to this podcast review for October 1st, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy, which means happy Halloween, everybody.
Yep, it is spooky season. We'll get to more of that as the month goes on, I'm sure.
I don't know.
However,
Halloween starts on October 1st, as far as I'm concerned.
For this episode, it's going to be really interesting because we are going to play a really fun game. And by that, I mean there have been episodes in the past where I have, let's say, been a little emotional when we've done certain reviews and conversations in the past.
That sleeve is wearing loudly.
However, that was all in the old format. And I bring that up to say, when I was doing preparations for this conversation earlier today, writing out a few notes, gathering my thoughts for The Wild Robot, I got into my feels. I
couldn't
was
hold it together?
getting emotional.
Could not hold it together.
And I had the thought of, well, this could be the first time that I get emotional in a conversation and it's on camera, where people would be able to see my goofy face succumb to said emotion.
I'm prepared for this. You tweeted how this movie reminded you of Midnight Special, to which my first thought was, we might be in trouble here, aren't we?
Yeah, we could.
Yeah.
We could. I had that moment. I mean, I briefly mentioned that in my reactionary sentiments walking out of the theater over the weekend. And then as I was gathering my thoughts, I put out that comparison shot there, the side by side.
Right.
And yeah, that's when I was really in my feels as I was gathering my notes here. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know how this is going to go. I want to say I'm confident that I've got it out of my system, that I feel pretty good right now. But who's to say? We don't know. We don't know.
What was the child's name in Midnight Special? Alden? Was that
Alton.
his name?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess Alden's the new Bright Bill, right?
Yep. Pretty much. We'll get into it. We'll certainly get into it. I have thoughts, and I'm very excited to talk about The Wild Robot, the latest film from DreamWorks, and the last film that they're going to be doing, at least in terms of internal animation, which is the sad bit of news coming out of this film, is that DreamWorks moving forward is going to outsource their animation, and a lot of animators are losing their jobs over at DreamWorks, and that is sad to hear. But that aside, if you're going to go out, you might as well go out on a high note. And I think there is going to be a reason to celebrate here.
Yeah, we'll talk about that and how this movie actually doesn't even feel anything like a DreamWorks film.
Yeah, we'll certainly talk about that. You know, it's funny. This was one of my most anticipated films of the year, even going back to January. It wasn't on my top 10 necessarily at the time, but it was a film that was very much on my radar.
Yeah.
Primarily because it's directed by Chris Sanders, who is one half of the directors that directed How to Train Your Dragon, of course. A film that I think is among the best animated films ever made.
I've got thoughts about that. And we'll wait. I'll wait to get into that. But you're not wrong in that pairing, that How to Train Your Dragon pairing between Chris Sanders and Dean Dubois. Of course, Dean Dubois would go on to finish that trilogy. Chris Sanders wasn't part of that. But yeah, you were right. The two of them did direct that first How to Train Your Dragon alongside Lilo and Stitch. They also worked on that film together too.
Absolutely. And of course, there were those early trailers. This was a film that was initially planned to be released in March, I believe, March or April of this year.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm maybe presumptuously assuming here, but
Yeah.
I imagine they took one last look at this film and realized, you know what? We might have a winner on our hands. Let's go ahead and push this back to the fall where we can
Mm-hmm.
premiere it at the Toronto International Film Festival, create some buzz there.
Where it
and we'll
almost
see-
won a People's Choice Award, if I'm not mistaken.
And that is something that I was really not anticipating. It was
Mhm.
exciting that, okay, we're moving this to the fall. We're confident in this film. And it will certainly be a player for
Yeah.
Best Animated Film when it comes to award season. But
Sure, for sure.
the moment that everyone at TIFF was like, no, this is one of the best films that we've seen at the festival, and it was genuinely in predictions to win the People's Choice Award, that really piqued my interest for sure.
It's
And
it's got the reviews to back it up, not just from
Yes.
critics, but the audience score as well is
Yeah.
really high. I think the aggregated score on Metacritic, for instance, is sitting around an 85, which, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't that DreamWorks' highest rated film in that specific aggregator? I think it might be.
It might
Yeah.
be. Yeah. Yeah. And as we talked about on the main show this last week, episode 604, it did very well at the box office in its opening
Yeah.
weekend as well. It's one of the
Yeah.
biggest openings for a non-franchise film, animated film, in quite
Hey,
some
guess
time.
what? Non-IPs can be good.
It turns out. It turns out. Which is very, very exciting. And I'm excited to dive into this one. So without further ado, Brendan, shall we jump into The Wild Robot?
Yeah, let's get wild.
All right. As we noted, this is written and directed by Chris Sanders. It stars Lupita Nyong'o, Pedro Pascal, Kit Connor, Bill Nighy, Stephanie Sue, Mark Hamill, Catherine O'Hara, Ving Rhames, a few others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with The Wild Robot, after a shipwreck, rather.
You're already a wreck.
I know. I can sort of pseudo feel it, so I'm trying to build my walls now, and that I think distracted me there for a moment.
Yeah.
After a shipwreck, an intelligent robot called Roz is stranded on an uninhabited island. To survive the harsh environment, Roz bonds with the island's animals and cares for an orphaned baby goose. All right, Brendan, as I gather
that
myself, what did you think about
Yeah.
The Wild Robot?
Maybe I should give a really long string of opening thoughts for like 20 minutes just to make sure you've officially composed yourself.
I don't know if there's any amount of time. Once I get into it, it's going to creep back. So
Cue the waterworks.
we'll see how it goes.
I went to see this with my wife Maris, and she was crying for most of the movie during it. So I can certainly understand where you're coming from here. And what I think is so interesting about this movie, which for the record I do really like, it goes back to what you were talking about there. How this is perhaps DreamWorks Animation's like last official film before they outsource, as you're talking about. So many animators are in fact losing their jobs. So it does
Yeah.
really feel like they saw this as an opportunity to really challenge themselves. Because I said it jokingly earlier, this doesn't really feel like a DreamWorks animation product. It feels very different. It really doesn't feel like anything we've had in the realm of traditional computer animation over the past 10 or 20 years. Tonally, I was more reminded of what you and I specifically, may have grown up with when we were kids. Maybe even dating back before that, animation in the 80s, for instance. I was thinking about movies like Watership Down or The Land Before Time. It has a very different tonal energy, which really did surprise me, especially given that this was directed by Chris Sanders, who isn't just one half of the How to Train Your Dragon team like we talked about with Dean DuBois there. Chris Sanders is kind of a legend in the animation realm. He has had story and even screenwriting credits on some of Disney's most classic films from the Renaissance era, such as Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast. I actually think he is one of the main credited screenwriters for Mulan, if I'm not mistaken. But as far as Chris Sanders solely as a director, so if I look outside of Lilo and Stitch and that first How to Train Your Dragon, which, like I said, co-directed with Dean DuBois, he solo directed The Croods, which I thought was fine. There was that pseudo live action film with Harrison Ford, The Call of the Wild, again, fine. So I was genuinely surprised how this felt like such an outlier, as if it was kind of a last ditch effort to really prove themselves as a premier animation studio in a way, because it is going for something very different. And thematically speaking, we'll certainly talk about the film's emotional core. I actually think the film is way more provocative than I'm seeing most people talk about. There are actually some interesting things here outside of its ideas on parenthood, and I'm sure you're going to make the Midnight Special comparison as well as you get into it. That's certainly there, but there's more going on that I do want to talk about if you're willing to engage in that conversation.
Sure.
And I'm actually kind of scratching my head over it. Like there are certain things here that I do think are genuinely interesting, and I don't know if the film was even going for those ideas. So I'm really curious how this conversation is going to go and how this film sort of recontextualizes itself with time, and if they even continue these stories. This is based on a book trilogy, if I'm not mistaken. So there may be more stories to tell, and I think Chris Sanders has even said he would be interested in going back to this world if he's able to. So maybe some of those potential ideas I sensed could get explored again. I'll get more into those details as this conversation goes. I don't want to keep talking and rambling because I just want to see you cry. I'm at that point now. So I'll cut it off here. I do think this is a very good film.
Yeah. So The Wild Robot, it is not just a really great animated film. I think this is one of the best films I've seen so far this year. It floored me, almost in a First Man kind of way, because when that film came out, I had no idea it would be about not Neil Armstrong going to the moon, but rather Neil Armstrong grieving over the loss of a child. Yeah. I did not pay too much attention to the marketing for this film. So I was taken aback by how it is this incredible examination of parenthood and love and acceptance in a way that is incredibly reminiscent of Hirokazu Koreda, in the sense that Roz, our titular robot, finds herself in this precarious situation of mothering this goose after she accidentally kills its family. And as a result, she discovers that she's capable of reprogramming herself in order to take on that responsibility, something that leads to her and Brightbill becoming this closely bonded family. Does that not sound a little familiar? I think it very much does for those that are Koreda fans like you and I. That alone,
makeshift family, baby. Makeshift family.
100%. That alone is so striking here. The idea that our programming changes as we evolve into parenthood is so moving and relatable. But it turns out that is only half of the film, because it's not enough to invoke Koreda and remind me of my experience with First Man. No! It has to go full on Midnight Special on me. Full on.
It gets to that moment earlier than you might expect, too.
Yeah, well, exactly. There is a scene at the midway point where Brightbill has to learn to fly so he can partake in the yearly migration with all of the other geese, which, by the way, Ving Rhames as Thunderbolt is incredible. Absolutely rules. Peregrine falcons are one of my favorite animals. I love that.
Yeah, that might be one of the most inspired casting choices of the year.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. That was arresting on its own as well. But then comes the day of the migration. And what we see is both hesitation and excitement from Roz. As much as she wants Bright Bill to stay, she knows he needs to go. And what plays out is arguably the scene of the year for me, where
Ooh, those are words. I love it.
helps Bright Bill get started on his flight. A great visual. Absolutely love that. But what follows is what kills me, where Roz, with every ounce of urgency, climbs to a high point to get one last look at Bright Bill before he flies away, possibly forever. And it is exactly the look that Michael Shannon's Roy character gives to Alton at the end of Midnight Special. It is verbatim.
Without the literal expression, and yet somehow Roz is very expressive.
It's incredibly expressive, and importantly, dialogue-less, right? Same
Which
thing.
is like that's a good point, because Lupita Nyong'o is so good in this movie as Roz. So of course she is able to provide that context, but this particular moment, as you said, is practically silent.
So in the visuals. And it's the same thing with Michael Shannon in Midnight Special. Yes, he calls out his name, but what really strikes you there is the look. It's the last look he gives Alton with no dialogue. It's the eyes.
Yeah.
It's the emotion. It's the I'm proud of you. It's the I will miss you. All of that is so evocative in Michael Shannon's performance, and he doesn't have to say a word to denote all of that emotion. And that is exactly what happens here with Roz.
He still has human eyes. He doesn't have animated robot eyes, and somehow those eyes still do the same thing.
It's incredible. And it's
pretty
blistering.
impressive. It's pretty impressive.
I agree. And you get the same information with Roz here, where she's reprogrammed herself to become a mother responsible for this being. Again, going back to the Coretta of it all and how unique of a circumstance that is. And then she has the Roy, I need to get one last look. And again, it's the urgency. Like, she sees him fly off, but that's not enough. I need to get one last look, a better look. And with every ounce of energy that she can muster, she climbs to the highest point to get that one last look. And Chris Sanders, God bless him, and the animators, I want to hug every single one of you, because the way the camera lingers, you get this close up on Roz. And again, it's the eyes, it's the expressiveness, it's the same look that Roy gives. And the emotion is spellbinding as she ponders that this might be the last time I see him, because in her mind it was. At that moment, it might have been the last time she ever saw Bright Bill, and she desperately wanted to have that moment. It is incredible. We love our kids. We do everything for them, but there comes a day. There it
is. Okay, you finally hit it. You finally hit your breaking point. You were doing so well, dude.
I was doing so well. There comes a day where we have to let them go so they can be who they're meant to be. The Wild Robot is the animated Midnight Special, and it absolutely slayed me.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about those things, because I feel like that's where the most interesting aspect of this conversation is going to be. Some of those provocative ideas that I feel like the film may or may not be going for are a little different than that, so maybe we can save that for a little bit later. But I will say, given the film's emotional core, all these people you said you want to quote-unquote hug, probably the biggest one you need to hug is Chris Bowers, the composer here.
Oh my gosh. That's another element of it. The score is blistering. It is so good.
And I'm looking at Chris Bowers's filmography as a composer on IMDb right now, and I feel like we can apply the same narrative to him as we do with John Powell and the history that John Powell had, and then all of a sudden he scores How to Train Your Dragon. Almost like Howard Shore scoring some great movies, but doing some more horrific kind of stuff, working with David Cronenberg and Jonathan
Yes.
Demme and David Fincher, and then all of a sudden scores The Lord of the Rings.
Comes out of nowhere with the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like there are certain
Yeah.
movies that composers may or may not have been born to compose, and I think Chris Bowers was maybe born to do this particular movie because it's very different than most of what he has worked on leading up to this.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
yeah.
It's fascinating because I had a very similar reaction when the reviews were coming out of TIFF because I certainly saw several reactions, reviews where people noted Chris Bowers' score and how magnificent it is. I immediately went to look at his resume. I was, of course, aware of Bowers, but I had that similar feeling of nothing really stands out to me with his work before. And you look at it, it's like, okay, well, he was a part of Green Book that had some success. The music isn't necessarily what stands out to me with that film. Chevrolet, maybe. Origin was probably his best work. I do really like the score to Origin.
Yeah, there's something
last
really
year.
hypnotic about that one. So I think he
Absolutely.
did good work there.
But outside of that, there really isn't a lot here that feels extremely noteworthy. And I was a little caught off guard. I was like, man,
Yeah.
I don't know what to expect here because outside of Origin, the rest of these don't really capture me as far as his scores go.
Yeah.
Certainly fine. I'm not saying that he's a bad composer or anything, but I was never struck by his work previously outside of Origin. And then here he comes with The Wild Robot. And it very much is a John Powell kind of, he was born to score this movie. And it is truly wonderful.
Well, I would say the same thing for Chris Sanders as a filmmaker here. Not necessarily in the sense that he was born to make this movie in particular, but just the fact that so many of the creators behind the scenes here are firing on very different cylinders than we would have expected from DreamWorks Animation up until this point. Like this almost feels like a blank check movie in a lot of ways. Like it feels like these animators were given completely free reign to really challenge themselves because this really does feel very distant from the Croods of the world or any other DreamWorks animation logo property. Even some of the best of DreamWorks, like I know a lot of people love the Shrek movies, and I understand why. They're not quite for us. But it has a very different energy. It's in a way, it really is the DreamWorks outlier. And I that's the thing I responded to the most. And it's not even just the tone of it all. It is the structure, because that moment you're talking about, that's very reminiscent of Midnight Special. That is the halfway point. That's the midpoint of the movie. This movie is a tale of two halves. And that's kind of a dangerous narrative line to find yourself in if you can't pull it off. And I do think the film mostly does. It actually has a good sense of balance, and the way it paces itself is really great too. It doesn't fully become a silent film like I thought it was going to. It actually does utilize dialogue pretty heavily, but I actually think it does it well enough so it doesn't find itself compared to, let's say, a movie like WALL-E. I think it could have easily fallen into those trappings.
Sure.
It
avoids that.
It does avoid that, yeah, because I think the backdrop could easily be compared to something like that, but it does end up avoiding that. It goes for a very different vibe. But it is going for a narrative propulsion here, if you will, that is pretty daring. It is actually a very bold way to tell this story.
I completely agree. And I think what's interesting, because I know there's an element to this film you want to talk about as well, I think that's where the brilliance of this film lies, because I think it gets to have its cake and eat it too. The first half of this film is an absolutely hypnotizing, astounding examination, rumination on parenthood, reprogramming ourselves as we find ourselves in that position, and how we come to love our kids again, not just providing for them, taking care of them, sheltering them, but inspiring them to become who they're meant to be, even at the cost of that relationship.
Yeah.
Again, going back to the Midnight Special of it all. And I think the film, even though that is only half the film, I think it is blistering in how it gets there. And not especially because the opening 10, 15, 20 minutes is establishing Roz, getting on the speech. How does she get there? Trying the mechanics and the mechanisms of her adjusting to being on this island with these animals around, and what her role is going to be on this island. It spends a decent amount of time there without rushing that. I think that is important in establishing Roz and
No, it's
her
well
character.
paced. You're right. Yeah.
It's very well paced in that regard. But once she takes on this responsibility, the film then taps into those formidable themes of parenthood and love and responsibility, while tapping into a different aesthetic, as you're talking about, than what we've seen with DreamWorks before, where I do think it taps into DreamWorks lore is with How to Train Your Dragon. I think that's where his experience on that film does come into play when it comes to the emotion
that's the
of
closest.
How to Train Your Dragon, the familiarity of the characters there, and the family dynamics at play, right? And that is built into the DNA of this film in a different way, but you can see that DNA bleed into this film. Now, aesthetically, in terms of its inspirations, that is where this film differs, especially as we get to the back half of the film. Yeah. And Chris Sanders has noted that this film is inspired by Hayao Miyazaki and classic Disney animated films, which is why, to your point, I do think the film, especially as we veer toward the back half, it does become something altogether as it relates to AI and technology and how that impacts the circle of life, if you will, preserving forest and animal life, and how this duality, how this dichotomy impacts each other. And that makes total sense to me when you look at, of course, the films of Hayao Miyazaki. All of his movies in some way have something to do with nature and preserving nature and the spirituality that comes along with that. Or even when you look at classic Disney, I think of something like Bambi and how there are parallels to be drawn between nature and man, and how this film invokes similar themes, whereas man is maybe imbued with the technology aspect of it. But it's a similar dynamic and a similar tonal dynamic. That's another fascinating aspect to this film as well, because the first half of this film and even in the back half, as the stakes of the film start to rise, it's interesting how this film is darker than anything DreamWorks has ever done.
It absolutely
really is. Even with some of the humor, I was surprised by how dark it was willing to go.
I mean, it's so dark, the Grim Reaper himself may as well be a character here. Like, they treat death, like the word death is probably uttered almost every other word. It's a bit hyperbolic to say, but
they're very aware of death and that it's around the corner at every turn.
Yeah, they very much are. So, and it's treated in a way that is sort of treated like a joke, but then not. It actually does take it seriously. It's not trying to shy away from the idea of death, which I do appreciate for a film like this.
Yeah, one of my favorite jokes of the film is Pinktail, the possum, when she's talking to Roz.
Says, her 7 kids.
And then I have 7 kids, and then you hear one of them eaten by something, and she's like, "Well, I got 6 kids now."
Yeah,
and it's like, man, like
they do kind of
kids all around the theater, and the film is willing to go there. At least to some degree. It's a little bit of the Snow White thing where it teeters as far as it possibly can to that line.
I mean, it does kind of course correct itself a few minutes later, which I think I didn't necessarily need, but I get why it's doing that for a kid's film for sure. You did bring up where this film goes in the back half, which is the thing I was alluding to that I want to talk about a little bit further, that I do think is pretty provocative, and maybe it might just be my reading of how it could be interpreted, because yes, there is very much of this dynamic at play, nature and technology, and that synergy, and how that could be discussed, how that could be evaluated. Very much reminiscent of, let's say, Hayao Miyazaki, who is very known for doing that very thing, especially with regard to technology. It's very much in the vein of something like Castle in the Sky or Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. It has some similarities there for sure. And of course, it's hard not to look at that idea given the current landscape of how AI is such a fearful thing in our world. So the way that it's treated in the back half here, there is a very tender quality regarding the preservation of nature, as you're talking about. I am wondering if there's another quality to this film that it might be aware of, maybe not. Maybe it's just my cynical view looking at it, because Roz isn't Roz and her or its integration here also kind of disrupts the balance of nature in a way that I don't necessarily think is good. There might be a bit of a cynical viewpoint here, because by the end, many of these animals are now living a life that completely goes against their survival instincts. And I think that is worth having a conversation about, if it is looking at AI in not necessarily a positive light, but it leads to an outcome that I think could perhaps raise questions. The reason why I bring it up is because when I left the theater, I thought, is that a misguided idea, or is it actually asking us to partake in that type of conversation? And the more I think about it, the more I think it might be deliberate. Like, I think it might be a deliberate form of provocation.
No, I think it is. And it's telling by one action that the film takes. I will do my best to dance around this to avoid spoilers. But for those that have seen the film, you'll know what I'm talking about here. The final shot of the film, the final scene, Roz and where she is, what she chooses is indicative of that conflict, the dangers that mankind pose in this film in form of technology and artificial intelligence. But she understands that she poses a threat. So I do think the film, by making that choice and placing her where she is in that final scene, to me, I think it is absolutely deliberate of those consequences and the turmoil that humanity had caused with Roz even landing there in the first place.
Yeah.
Because it's acting as a movie, when we're filtering out the movie components of it, there are certainly aspects of it that lean into that more endearing kid quality.
I mean,
thing.
that's its target audience, so I get that it's doing that,
which is
but
fine.
it's not disregarding these other complicated ideas.
Exactly. And I think that's why Roz ends up where she is. If the film did not want to have that conversation, I think Roz just stays where she would want to be, right?
Yeah.
With all of her new friends.
There is one exchange between two animals I could have admittedly done without, and it's between a fox and a bear. I'll simply say I admittedly could have done without, because I feel like maybe that's the one line that seems to suggest, oh, these animals are at peace now. Everything's happy. It's like, but that kind of goes against their survival instincts. I don't know if that's a good thing. But I think given the action that Roz takes that you're talking about, perhaps that ambiguity is still preserved. So I do think by the end credits here, I'm not sure if anything is really all that resolved by the end, which is why I think it might be interesting to see more stories told in this world. And I'm not really sure what the books actually go into. If there is a trilogy's worth of material here, does it explore that idea of the balance of nature being somewhat disrupted and whether that's good or bad? I think there's room to look at this movie in maybe a slightly cynical way. The movie I was actually reminded of was Powell and Pressburger's A Matter of Life and Death, which we've talked about before.
Yeah.
We could talk about how the power of love is such a inviting and warm concept that movie talks about, but what if it was just science and medicine that saved this man's life? And I think that movie does a great job having it both ways. And maybe The Wild Robot has a similar thing on its mind. Like maybe you can have it both ways.
Honestly, I think so, because I do think there is a reading of it, and maybe this is where I slightly lean given the tone of the film in those final scenes, but I think maybe within the allegory, the film is simply suggesting the importance of unity as it relates to um preserving nature and why we need to be uniform in that fight. I think maybe that's what it's going for there with some of those final exchanges.
As if to suggest a temporary truce that this environment needs
Yes.
to agree upon before they resort back to their animalistic
Yeah.
instincts that they need to survive.
Yes. I think that's what it's going for because, yes, in a more logical setting, in order for them to survive, for them to physically survive, that unity would have to
They
dissipate
still
at some
need
point.
to eat each other.
They still have to eat. Yeah, the circle of life still has to exist.
Yeah.
But this is a documentary, obviously, and it's not trying to get into.
I mean, I was halfway hoping for Jane Goodall to show up or something like that.
Yeah, like it's not going to. It's not Nat Geo making this movie after all, right? So, like, it's not going to get into those realms. So I understand why Chris Sanders makes the choices he does and leans into the metaphor of it all, which is what I think it's ultimately doing. But I do think by placing Roz at the end where she is, instead of making it this, and again, I know I'm dancing around spoilers here, it does end on a hopeful note, but it's not, I still wouldn't call it a conventional happy ending where
There's still a
everyone
little
gets to live
hole
their
there
life.
that you can kind of poke and
Yes.
poke through.
It's
and
still
it's
not
like, wait a minute, there's
happily ever after. Not truly.
not in the traditional sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to bring it up. And I haven't really seen many reviews out there commenting on this side of the movie. And that's not to say those reviews are wrong. It's just, the thing that really works about this movie, that allegory on parenthood that we spent the first half of this conversation talking about, that is worth talking about. The movie does succeed in that. But I do think there are more layers here that are buried underneath that are like for a kids movie, it'll certainly go over their heads, and that's fine. That's for people like us to talk about, right? But I think those cynical viewpoints might be there, and that in a way is making the movie really interesting to me.
I agree, especially when you hear Chris Sanders talk about how he was inspired by Hayao Miyazaki, early Disney. I think those influences are vivid here in tone, in some of the imagery, and some of the humor, as we've been talking about. I very much felt those vibes, and that was very distinctive for a DreamWorks animated film, for sure, hands down.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I do love that dire quality that comes out in this film. So as much as I am drawn to its commentary on parenthood and programming and what that means, I was as enthralled by how it taps into Studio Ghibli and those early Disney vibes. I certainly thought of Bambi. I thought of The Fox and the Hound a little bit, Robin Hood even in some places. Like I love how the film is willing to embrace death in nature and how those things are a factor, especially when the stakes are this high, when we're talking about the vital impacts that humanity and technology has on nature. And we see that war in a pretty stimulating way in that back half.
Yeah, it's very much a classic eco fable in many ways, which is why I said the movie reminded me most of movies that you and I may have grown up watching in our youth. It feels like something that would have come out in the 80s, maybe early 90s at the latest. And I know it's common when people see a DreamWorks movie that they really like, the common response is, oh, maybe that's something Pixar could have done, because Pixar is usually the high standard when it comes to computer animation. But this doesn't even feel like a Pixar film either. Like it feels kind of distant from that. It feels like it came from a different era, which gave me this weird sense of nostalgia as well. Just even in the animation quality and the way the music matches the animation quality, it has a very different vibe, which even if I were to disregard these complexities that may or may not be there, and I do think they are there for the record,
I agree.
It's a great sensory experience outside of that. Yeah, it's tapping into something I did not expect at all.
I did not expect it either. Again, I did stray away from the marketing, but I think that's why I was so blown away by this film and its complexities, because I am reminded of the sorrow of something like Bambi, the gloom of something like Pinocchio, The Land Before Time you brought up earlier. I didn't really think of that myself, but I think that is a great influence here as well. Hayao Miyazaki, of course, is quite noticeable. And when you couple that with its midnight special qualities, and that is such a foreboding aspect of this film as well, that shot, that close up on Raz, as I noted earlier, the whole relationship, the Hirokazu Koreeda of it all, that is another aspect of it. I love Hirokazu Koreeda. He's one of my very favorite filmmakers working today, and the man is a master at creating films about found families. And that's exactly what this is. It's Midnight Special and Hirokazu Koreeda coming together in an animated way. I did not anticipate that at all.
It really does feel like a parallel universe of sorts, where DreamWorks hired, instead of Chris Sanders, they hired Hayao Miyazaki to direct and co-write this book, or this adaptation of this book, with Hirokazu Koreeda. And they said, also make it an adaptation of Midnight Special. This is what they churn out.
We'll bring in Jeff Nichols. We're bringing Miyazaki. We'll just have all of our favorite people together working on that. That's what it feels like.
We've talked about this before. An Avengers-style director's team, right?
Is
the Wild Robot the hypothetical
it might
result
be
of that?
It might be. If I ever had the opportunity to interview Chris Sanders, the first thing I would ask him is, did you interview Koreeda, Miyazaki, and Jeff Nichols for this project? Because you couldn't convince me you didn't. Surely he reached out to them and had a conversation, because the imprint of those influences are all over this film. And I don't say that as a bad way, obviously. I love how he embraces those aesthetics, those traits of those great filmmakers, and seamlessly infuses them into this film with this specific story. And it's brilliant. It's absolutely incredible how it all comes together. And even though it's a tale of two halves, I think it's parental roots in that first half, how that informs the AI and the human interference of nature versus nurture in the back half of the film. That is all, like it almost, like the way we describe it and the way it sounds on paper, it feels like it's disjointed and it shouldn't work, but it does.
It does. I'm with
you.
This feels like a new debut of sorts for Chris Sanders, because I'm looking at the films that he has directed thus far, and I may have misspoke earlier. He did direct The Croods, but that also was apparently a co-directing job. That was with Kirk D'Amico. So most of his work as a director and writer as well have been collaborations of sorts.
Very collaborative.
And that's not a bad thing. Most animated films are made through collaboration. It's just a very different type of filmmaking, right? You don't often get animated films that are the sole vision of a filmmaker, unless you're Hayao Miyazaki or Brad Bird. I feel like they're the two that you often cite as, like the consistent through line for their respective films. And even when Chris Sanders worked on How to Train Your Dragon, that trilogy kind of became more Dean Dubois' baby in a way. And I think there was a lot of him in that first film too, given where that trilogy ended up going, for sure. And the fact that Dean is directing the live action How to Train Your Dragon coming out next year. I think that's not a coincidence. So Chris Sanders, he directed that live action, The Call of the Wild, like I mentioned earlier, but this feels like a reintroduction of sorts. I feel like if he's going to go on to direct more films and they're kind of a piece with the Wild Robot, I would almost feel hard pressed to say this is his true starting point. And it feels like a new thing in a way, and I found that genuinely interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's hard to tell based off of his resume. This simply could come down to it being his masterpiece. this is the outlier.
It just feels so different. Like it feels like a complete, like I said, it feels like a blank check of sorts. And I love that. I love that that's the case.
I agree. And I love the influences that are here, as I noted earlier. And, you know, there is something about his direction here. It's interesting when we talk about direction, like the best directors of the year. I feel like animation almost is never in the conversation. I feel like Sanders has to be at least a part of the conversation this year.
You know, I often wonder why that's the case, why we don't tend to consider animators among best director. And maybe it's because animated films have a history of being collaborative, like we talked
Maybe
about.
that's it.
And it's kind of created maybe like this inadvertent stigma of sorts. So animated films tend to always be seen as collaborative efforts more so than the next Paul Thomas Anderson film, for instance. But The Wild Robot is Chris Sanders' baby. At least it feels like it is. So is this an exception to that rule? And I think it could be.
I think it could be. I don't suspect it will be. I'm not expecting that at all, especially when
I don't think it will
Miyazaki
either.
has never been a part of that conversation. Not in an awards, conventional awards way.
Right.
And that's disheartening. I really wish that Miyazaki would be considered for best director. And, you know, because I think animators, or animated films rather, they, you know, they should be a part of that conversation more. At any rate, I love this film. I really like it a lot. I do want to spend at least a little time here talking about the performances. Lupita Nyong'o is quietly having a spectacular year. She has had a phenomenal 2024 as far as I am concerned. She's really great here. And while you do somewhat recognize the voice, she disappears so wonderfully into this character. And I love Roz. I love how she does bring this mechanic to the role that feels robotic, but it slowly evolves into something more human by the end. I do love how that kind of slowly deconstructs itself.
It's got the Haley Joel Osment effect.
Yeah, it really does. And I love the brilliance of that. Kit Connor, I think, is really good here in a limited role. Pedro Pascal, I had
no idea that was him. I had no idea that was him.
It was him as well. Like, he really disappears.
Of course, he's voicing a fox, and he has what you would expect the sarcastic wit of a fox to have. But my first thought was, oh, is that Jason Bateman from Zootopia voicing a fox again?
You know, it's hard to separate those two.
Yeah,
but I do think I think they're ultimately distinctive in the end.
Oh, they are. They are. That was a bit of a
slyness to both of them.
Yeah.
But you know what? And again, I think it just kind of comes back to the vision that Chris Sanders here and its emotional core, because there is an element of that with Fink here where he talks about, sometimes subtly, where he talks about his loneliness that he feels. He doesn't know what it's like to have a family. And again, the animators, I think, do a great job of tapping into that as well. So I love that dynamic throughout the film. I think it's really fantastic.
Yeah, but you're right that the remaining voice cast here is, I mean, pretty much everyone here is great, because if you didn't know who was actually voicing who here, you might not pick up on who they were, like which actor it was.
Bill Nighy, I did recognize immediately, but I love that. I love him. And
there's always got to be one.
Voice.
There's always got to be one that's like, oh, it's that guy or it's that gal. You know, like there's always got to be one like that. But the majority of these performances do blend in pretty well with their characters. And you don't find yourself distracted by, oh, you're playing like the famous card game. Like, oh, this actor, I know them. Oh, this actor, I know them. It's not like that. Even when people like Mark Hamill or Stephanie Sue show up, you don't really ever notice them.
Didn't really notice at all.
It got to the end of the movie, and I knew Mark Hamill was in this movie somewhere. I still didn't know what character he was playing until the end credits. Like,
Yeah.
It's that kind of blending job that I think is very good.
Yeah, I completely agree. And unsurprisingly, Catherine O'Hara is hysterical again. Obviously, we just talked about her a few weeks ago.
she was okay. Aside from Bill Nighy, she was perhaps the closest I was able to recognize. But that's also because I remember her distinct voice work in something like Where the Wild Things Are, and she's doing some kind of similar things as I think Judith is who she played in that one. But even so, that's the right kind of actor to kind of do the Leonardo DiCaprio point at the screen. Oh, I know that person. Like it's fine.
I think she's very funny here. Is really my point there. Like I think she does a really great job of again kind of playing into those dire qualities, but in a way that's playful and fun.
It's funny,
and that can be a tricky tone to get, but they do a great job of writing that line very well. So, and just the kind of the hand painted aesthetic of the film, I think, is also really unique. I love that as well. Yeah. I mean, I typically like I love the animation for How to Train Your Dragon at the very least. It is breathtaking. The animation in those films, especially the flying sequences, are gorgeous.
Yeah.
But there is something about how this film invokes something so different for DreamWorks that, again, is reminiscent of either early Disney or the 80s, even as you talked about earlier, Miyazaki in some ways. I love the visual palette of the film. It's
really good.
And it is one of the more beautiful looking movies of the year as well.
Yeah. Probably the best animated film of the year. My first reaction walking out of the theater was, maybe I slightly preferred Transformers 1, but that one had the surprise factor, which I think really sells that one. This one has a very different surprise factor, but I also knew the positive word of mouth going in, so I knew some people had already considered this to be among the best films of the year, period, regardless of it being animation or not. But I think it is, certainly in the animation realm, the most provocative film we're going to get this year. I mean, there are more animated films we still need to see, but there is something underneath The Wild Robot that does get you thinking, whether you notice it or not. Like we talked about in this conversation, I think there's definitely something there.
Yeah, I mean, this is easily the best animated film of the year as far as I am concerned. And I love Transformers 1. I do really like it a lot as well. I mean, that's my 1A and 1B. And I love Inside Out 2. I will still champion that film in a lot of ways. I think it's great.
I think it's pretty good.
But I do think Transformers 1, I think the Wild Robot for me is easily in my top 10 of the year. I think it is that good. I think it is one of the very best films of the year, period. I don't care what kind of movie you're talking about.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I'm quite there yet, but I have to think about it more.
I'm easily there. And I think it's, again, all of these nuances and the complexities, the fact that it gets to have its cake and eat it too. And it's able to revel in this deep rooted emotion about parenthood and programming and love. And, because like, I know we haven't really talked about too many great examples here, and maybe I should spoil a few of them. So fair warning, I guess, since we're
at the end of the conversation anyway, so I think we're good.
But all of the dynamic that we see between Roz and Brightbelt early on in those early scenes, it truly is wonderful in terms of the love. And even though she doesn't recognize, like, there's this motif of her realizing that her programming is changing and there's something internally that she doesn't really recognize. Which I think is fascinating, especially when you couple it with the Coretta aspect of it in terms of found family. It's not something that she was built for, and she internally has to reconfigure herself, and she does, and she recognizes it, but she can't articulate it.
Yeah.
And neither can Brightbill. There's that somewhat heartbreaking, awkward goodbye they have when he's about to take off with the migration, where they don't really know how to say goodbye. Which again is what infuses that desperation in Roz to climb to that high point to see him as he flies away, which is breathtaking for all the reasons we noted earlier. And then as, again, spoilers, as Bright Bill eventually lands back and there's all of the fighting going on, and there comes to that moment in the ship and she's, incapacitated, and Bright Bill has to find a way to bring her back, and they have that exchange there. I think the film very much earns that moment and the ones that follow, and how even the film concludes with this whole recognition of, I will always know that it's you. As a parent, as someone who has had to, and I think a lot of parents, I mean, I don't know about your screening. At my screening, it was audibly noticeable the parents in my vicinity that struggle to contain themselves. I mean, and part of this,
quite for me.
It's also challenging to watch this film and experience that deep rooted emotion when you bring your kids, which is another part of it.
That's what I was gonna ask. Did Sam enjoy this as well?
Sam really did enjoy it, but the parents around me, I think, were more affected than the children were, and that to me was really like there was a mom to my left and her daughter, and to my right there was another set of parents with their kids as well. I all of them, and me. I'm not discluding myself. Obviously.
You were joining in, but
the whole theater, every parent was deeply moved in some way, shape, or form. And the woman next to Sam, she was like grabbing her daughter, like she was uncontrollably sobbing. It was really affecting. Like, as much as I love the film, there was something about seeing her. And I imagine this woman, I could be wrong, I don't know, but I imagine that she's not a cinephile, a critic who comes to the theaters as much as I do. She's part of the general audience. I think, seeing her so deeply affected by the art that she could barely move in the aftermath of it. There was something about witnessing that alone that I found so inspirational. I found so deeply affecting.
I think it's the fact that it's a reaction like that coming from a woman's perspective, because Roz.
There's a lot here specifically about motherhood, for sure.
Yeah, I called Roz a quote unquote it earlier on in this conversation because it's not a physical human being, but we might as well call her a she, simply because she is voiced by Lupita Nyong'o, and the motherhood aspect is certainly ringing louder than fatherhood. It's definitely really more about motherhood than just broadly parenthood. But even talking about the film on the way home with my wife, she was even commenting on the way it actually depicts the pain and the body changes that you go through after pregnancy. What Roz goes through, the physical deterioration of Roz is actually kind of reminiscent of that kind of thing as well, whether it's going for that or not. So my wife found it very moving for that reason, the fact that it was from the perspective of a woman. Okay, this movie is really complex. I think it is. These added layers here.
I think that's such a fascinating perspective, and I can wholly empathize with that, and I do think that's there. I obviously don't have that perspective, but what I was able to relate with is, again, that idea of your internal programming changing. And oftentimes, it's not something you can control. Now, Roz talks about it as something that she was able to manipulate herself. But there is, I think the metaphor there is still applicable regardless of who you are, because your programming does change. You do find yourself responding in a very similar way that Roz does here, in terms of the sacrifices, and not just in terms of the programming change, the emotional spectrum that she ultimately conveys, but some of the physical sacrifices that are made here as well is something that is a big part of the responsibility. And I do love the lengths the film is willing to go in that as well. So I do think there are, speaking from my experience, and I assume that many listening out there that are also parents can relate and will back this up. But I think in terms of reflecting the complexities of the parental responsibilities and all of the changes you go through as a parent. This film taps into it in such a deeply doleful way that I couldn't help but be moved by. And then
Sure.
you compound that with the whole midnight special of it all. Like, that's an extra layer on top of what I'm talking about. Like, that's a whole nother aspect of the film that, again, I didn't really see coming. Especially when we get to that parallel shot to Roy. Like, it's remarkable. It, like, the layers upon layers upon layers here, I was astounded by. And again, like, I just went on a rant, and that doesn't even include the whole Miyazaki inspired artificial intelligence versus nature component. That is a whole separate conversation, which we had earlier, that has tons of layers in it as well. So there are complexities upon complexities upon complexities with this film. And then there's the animation, there's the score, the brilliant score, one of the best scores of the film, the performances. I mean, you can't convince me this isn't one of the best movies of the year. It is. For my money, it is. 100%.
Do you think this could get recognized by the time we get to the year end? Let's say hypothetically, if this ends up doing really good box office numbers in the coming weeks and not just its opening weekend. Obviously, it's not going to pull Inside Out 2 numbers. I think we can pretty much predict that. I mean, if it were to pull Inside Out 2 like numbers, this is pretty much guaranteed to get a Best Picture nomination. But I given the reaction of TIFF and the fact that it almost won the People's Choice Award there, which has been very historically indicative of pretty big awards players, like, could this be another one of those outliers in the animation realm? I think I don't know. I don't know.
I don't know either. I think it'll come down to DreamWorks and how Universal pushes this during the awards season. I don't know if we've seen an animated film go too much beyond, trying to get, I guess, the main category, the main animated category. But I think there's a world here where if Universal plays their cards correctly, that a best adapted screenplay nomination is absolutely possible at the very least. I think a Chris Bauer score nomination could be possible as well. And if everything aligns, if the Academy responds to this film the way I hope they could, or they will, I think it could. I think it could. And I've been somewhat joking about it in recent days. Let's get this nominated for Best Picture. I don't know. In all likelihood, it's not going to get that far. However,
I'm predicting
I
it won't, but still,
I do think it's worthy. I think it's worthy.
I always like
way.
I always like having conversations like this. Whether I think it's worthy or not is almost beside the point. I just like when there's a shakeup from the norm when it comes to how and what movies get recognized in traditional categories. And I think this is a movie that could have those qualities, that it could lead to a shakeup. And I like the idea of that happening.
I'm so excited for animated film that not just that category, but maybe where they could be major players here, because two other great films that people keep talking about is Flow and what is the other one?
Memoir of a Snail, the Adam Elliott film.
Of it? Yeah. So those two, by all accounts, are also really great. And I don't know, like, animated film this year could be fast. Like, I really hope Transformers 1 is able to transcend its box office and land. Now, what really gives me pause there is Turtles last year, because I thought Turtles was very good. Like, it sits very similar to where Transformers 1 is now, because Turtles also didn't do well at the box office, but it did well enough with critics. It was a fun surprise, kind of came out of nowhere in a lot of ways, but then ultimately it gets snubbed by the Academy.
Yeah.
That could be Transformers 1 this year.
Probably.
Depending on how Moana is, how that one does. I think that could be the X factor here. But man, there's a world where Transformers 1, and I'm with you, even though I do prefer The Wild Robot, Transformers 1 is still a very good movie. Like, that's easily my number 2 at the moment. And then you include Flo, you include Snail. Like, what if those are the top 4 and then Disney and Pixar are fighting for a 5th there? I don't know. There's something so refreshing about that.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, we know Inside Out 2 is going to get in simply because of how much money it made. So it really just comes down to the other 4.
That would come down to being the 5th.
Yeah. So, but you're right. Moana 2 is perhaps the
that could be the one left out.
That's not even the one left out. It's kind of the it's kind of the question mark here in many ways, because for all we know, that could end up being the other Inside Out 2 from this year. For all we know.
Mm-hmm. And look, ultimately, that is a Disney film. Disney historically does very well. I am not necessarily anticipating, like, all Moana 2 has to do is be okay. If it sits around, let's say 70% on Rotten Tomatoes, does okay at the box office, and I assume it will because people really like that first Moana. I think it's going to make money, no doubt about it. And if it gets decent enough reviews, it just has to be okay. It doesn't even have to be great. Yeah. And it's going to get in. And then ultimately it's Transformers that gets out, or Flo gets snubbed, as we've seen with Ghibli 1,000 times before. Or not just Ghibli, but foreign film, like foreign animated film tends to not, like, it's kind of hit or miss. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
But one of those will ultimately kind of get snubbed there.
And I don't think we're forgetting anything. I think those are really the big category, or the big examples of the best animated feature film category here. I don't think there's anything else we're missing out.
No, the only other one is the Lord of the Rings film, but I don't know what to expect from that, honestly. I'm prejudging it because of the trailer. I'm still interested in it, but I don't know if it'll land as far as like one of the top 5. I don't expect it to kill at the box office, but maybe I'll be wrong. I don't know.
The only other 2 I can think of, I think there's another Wallace and Gromit movie coming out this year, and that style of animation is so unique it might lend itself to a bit of an edge. I'm not really sure. But then there's also the pseudo animated documentary, Lego documentary of Pharrell Williams, which I have not really heard great things about. But maybe the uniqueness might be enough to populate a slot in that category.
Yeah, I totally forgot about that one too. I don't know. I guess it'll depend on the reaction. I mean, because again, if it gets middling reviews, and because I think about like the Lego movie too.
Yeah, they might just call it a documentary, and they might not even qualify for animation. I'm not really sure.
That's true. That's a great point. I don't, because something like Flea, did they consider that more documentary than animation? I'm not even sure.
That's a good question. Where did they nominate that sucker?
Yeah. I can't really recall here off the top of my
IMDb,
head.
Oscar nominated for 3 Oscars.
Okay.
Documentary and animated feature. So there's that answer. I love that. I kind of love that. I mean, sure, why not? Get it in both. It's really great. Okay, so that's always possible. Well, then I kind of wonder, and I don't know what the math is because I think there is some sort of a formula, but I noted on the main show, I want to say last week maybe, or this week, I can't recall, but there's that Netflix film, The Remarkable Life of Ibelin, which is primarily animated, or a lot of it is, but there is a live action component. Yeah.
I don't know what the math is. If I had to guess, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70-30, maybe 60-40, perhaps.
We need to get an Oscars expert on the show to really know how all that works.
So, well, I mean, even outside of the Academy's standards, and you're right, we need to get someone who knows what that is. I
Yeah.
also need to find out what the actual ratio is because I don't
Yeah.
know. But my point in that is to say is if it does fall under the the whatever the formula is, then that could possibly have a Flea type effect.
Yeah,
where it gets
maybe.
animated and documentary. I don't know if it'll go that far, but I think it's really great. That's also one of my favorite films of the year, but
Yeah,
we'll
good
get
stuff.
to that at another time.
Good stuff.
At any rate, The Wild Robot, I love it. It is one of my favorite films of the year. I think it has a ton of nuance. I cannot wait.
And you
to
only
see it
cried
again.
once.
Yeah, I got through this okay.
Yeah,
And,
nice work.
I felt confident coming into the conversation, but, once you get in and you start invoking Michael Shannon and Midnight Special, there's always that chance.
Yeah, that the
Succumb a
Midnight
little
Special
bit.
is your trigger word.
Yeah, exactly. Great film. I love it. If you agree or disagree with this, you can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. And I guess before we get out of here, just a reminder, episode 604, we talk about ambitious failure movies. That was a lot of fun. We talk about the current discourse, the cinematic discourse, and how fun that is.
Fun. That's a fun word you use to describe fun discourse.
Yeah, all kinds of great things. So you can go check that out. We're also going to have a review of Megalopolis coming soon as well. So be on the lookout for that. And a new Chasing the Gold, the new Women in Session this week as well. All right, Brennan, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Well, this is when the movie season gets tiring for us, when there's only two of us here to do these main reviews, because there's so many things we're getting that we want to talk about that I feel like we're gonna have to maybe save for some type of catch-up episode. We're gonna have to do one very soon, and I don't just mean movies that you and I caught up with maybe a few months later than they were released from this year. I mean movies like, let's say, My Old Ass, which is playing in theaters now. I'm getting Saturday Night this weekend. We're obviously getting Joker 2. There's the Outrun, the Saoirse Ronan film. So we already have 3 major players in one weekend. Once again, it's getting complicated. It's getting complicated.
It is, and you're right, because like My Old Ass, I do want to see. It's in theaters right now for me here locally as well. Finding a moment to get to the theater has been challenging, but I am eager to catch up with that one. And you're right, there's films like The Outrun. I am now getting screeners because it's that time of the year. So I did get a screener for that. I got a screener for the documentary Sugarcane, which I've heard really great things about as well. And a few others that are just kind of hitting the inbox every single day. Plus getting invitations for like Venom: The Last Dance. I think they're showing that here in the next week or so.
Yeah, of course.
So like it's going to be very busy. And I am also doing some catch up. Like I just recently watched In a Violent Nature. I have some thoughts on that. I would love to add to a catch up episode.
Oh yeah.
So,
yeah.
Wolf,
I forgot I saw that.
yeah. I know. Like I am a fan of slow cinema, so there are things I really liked about that film. So there's certainly things I can talk about in that kind of format. Same thing with the John Watts film Wolves, which is not good. It is a not good movie, and perhaps in a catch-up episode I could talk about why it's not so good. It is one you can probably avoid. Like I also caught up with Hundreds of Beavers. Have you seen that one?
I haven't even heard of this one.
You haven't even heard of it? Oh man, people are talking about it. So,
are they really?
You
must not be on social media enough anymore.
You don't. Yeah, you need to get on.
No, I don't. No, I don't.
Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't be on more. You're right. You should stay away. No, there is a movie. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. It is called Hundreds of Beavers. It came out way earlier in the year, I think in January or February. But I heard a lot of people raving about it. It has a 97% on Rotten Tomatoes. So it was very well reviewed. It is very, very Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton inspired.
I'm looking at the images of it. It looks like it's trying to go for some type of quirky Gold Rush kind of thing. It's
Yeah. So
What is this thing?
Yep. And look, see, I would love to
For those
talk
on
about
YouTube,
it.
if you don't, what is this thing?
Yeah. People can go check it out. People can go check it out. Again, it's got really good reviews. But maybe I'm just the wrong audience, ironically, because
Again, for YouTube audiences, if this poster does not sell you, I don't know what does. Like, that is insane.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I will say this though, like, as a Charlie Chaplin fan, like, he's on my Mount Rushmore of directors, and even though this is a film that is invoking him quite a lot, I don't think I'm the target audience. I really don't. Because that is a film that wants to mimic Charlie Chaplin, but doesn't know what makes a Charlie Chaplin movie a Charlie Chaplin movie. Like, there's a big difference between the two. So once you see it, we can have that conversation, I guess, is what I'm trying to say here.
Okay.
But
Wow.
you know, it'd be worth talking. I mean, it's gotten really well reviewed, and people are talking about it.
Yeah, I've
as far
noticed.
as, like, you know, little quirky films to catch up for the year. So at any rate,
More homework.
more homework. That's the name of the game this time of year.
Yeah.
All right. With all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. The Wild Robot destroyed me and the whole audience. Really.
Get wild. Get robotic.